I'm a former teacher, so I agree. Yeah, later.
Yesterday,
Yeah, but you know, let's get down. I guess. I know, it's that. Yeah, you're in the right place. Yeah, I don't know, but it's, yes. All the. Price for that. You know, when I see it, and I said.
I'm gonna go get her.
Yeah. Right.
Maybe I'm going.
It's gonna stop.
I know, today, I'm just like.
Okay, if you're a new agent, and you have one of these, a newer agent, a year or less, or you haven't been in production in a while, we're having a contest all of June. So you keep track of all the classes that you attend, and for each class that you attend, then you get entered into a drawing. And not sure what that is, but it's given. So does anyone need one of these? You have a sponsor for this class, and I'm gonna go ahead and let you come up and talk for a few minutes. Bob will be on his way in.
Okay, I'm not, it's not, I don't know what. Okay. Yeah, you know, that's.
Okay, this is Madeline with Parent Roofing, so we're gonna give her all of our attention so she can talk for just a few minutes.
Hello. Okay. How many of you guys are familiar with Tarrant Roofing before I start going on and on? Okay. So you probably just need a little refresher on how fabulous we are, which is what I'll do. And to anybody who's new, I'll give you the new information. I have these lovely folders. I'm going to leave some in the back for you guys to grab when you're finished up. And what is in these folders is an example of our 5-page report. So if you give us a call before noon, we will be out there the same day. We have our salesmen are all over the DFW area. They tell me not to say this, but I'll say it anyways. Call us afternoon. We'll probably still be there the same day. We know that things are moving super quick in real estate right now, and you guys are under time crunches majority of the time, and we want to make sure that we're able to come through for you. So we arrange our schedule so that if you call us and say, oh, my option period is closing on Friday and it's Wednesday, we'll say, okay, no worries. We'll be out there. We'll take care of it. So we make sure that we leave those open spaces for you. We value you and your clients. So this 5-page report, if you give us a call before noon, we'll be there the same day. We'll issue this same page report within 24 hours. Oftentimes you'll get it right away because our salesmen bring their iPads into the truck, and so they'll take care of it immediately for you. In that 5-page report is an explanation of whether or not the roof passes inspection, whether it needs to be repaired, fully replaced, or it's just good to go. After that, and it goes down through the whole rundown of the nitty gritty of what is going on with that roof. We also include photos because I know it's a novel idea, but our roofers are actually going to climb up on top of the roof. They bring a ladder. They're not doing those driveway inspections where we look up and go, yeah. Whole new roof, definitely needs it. Now, our guys are gonna get up there, they're gonna take photo evidence, and then they're going to assist with the claim. We have a 98% success rate with insurance companies, so we are able to help you out with those as well. So in addition to that, helping with insurance claims, it's also great for pre-listings to have those photos on on that 5-page report. So it's another asset to you guys as well. We also offer prepaid deductibles. So if you have a house, the seller has a house, let's say it's 10 years old, the roof passes inspection, it's fine. But the buyer is thinking, this is Texas, a storm's gonna come through, I'm gonna have to buy a new house and then buy a new roof 6 months, a year later. And it's a concern for them. The seller can prepay the deductible. So that way, if that does happen and they do need a new roof after a year purchasing a brand new home, it's already paid for, it's taken care of. So it's just another good concession. I know a lot of people are waiving a lot of those right now because things are moving so fast, but it's a good thing to keep in mind, especially in Texas, just to add a little bit of insurance and make people feel comfortable on their purchase. In addition to roofing, there's also a little bit of information in here. There's a flyer that's about our windows and siding. So we also do windows and siding. We have a fabrication facility out in Fort Worth. And we're able to get that house all the way back to its pre-storm condition. So I use the example of a 12-ounce Coke can. You crush a 12-ounce Coke can down, we could restore it back to a 12-ounce Coke can, but we can't make it into a 16-ounce. That makes sense, yeah? So the only things that we're not touching are balconies, foundations, and pools, but everything else we will take care of for you guys. Our guys will get out there and help take care of gutters. We'll help take care of fences. We've even had people inside the house painting up some walls because there was some leaks and caused some damage. So we will truly help with all of that. In addition to being able to restore the home, we also protect it. We have a new program. If you're familiar with Tarrant, you might not yet be familiar with our home warranty. And if you are not, I encourage you to go take a look at our website, which is Tarrant HWS homewarrantyservices.com. And it will give a rundown of all the pricing. We're really straightforward with it. A lot of people make you input so much information before they give you any kind of numbers. We don't do that. Our base plan starts at $795, goes up from there depending on size of the house and what type of coverage that you're needing. Something that's really awesome about our home warranty is that we cover the roof. We're not just covering everything underneath it. We're also covering the roof. So that is a pretty big deal, especially in the state of Texas, where that's a pretty often need. So yeah, this is just a little bit about Tarrant. I left some goodies for you in the back. If you guys feel the need for a snack or water, brought some soda for you as well. Like I said, I will leave these folders back there. Please don't hesitate to give us a call. Thank you very much.
I saw Bob. He walked by and then he waited. Oh, here he is. He didn't tell me he was waiting.
Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Oh, look at there. Look at that. Coca-Cola.
I know. Bob, you brought it in.
Do we need more copies? We'll make one.
Does everybody need to have a copy?
Anybody still need a copy of the material? There will be a test. Back in the back. Back on the. Well, yeah. All right. How is it? It's. I have lawyers evaluation. People say, "Bob, your goals are way too high."
Your option is you can take.
Yeah.
There was one left. It's fine, yes. No worries. I wrote it over. But very big deal. If you want your dog, you might stay where I would say. Whatever they see them doing.
I talked to someone about Coca-Cola. They have one of these little ones. They said, have you seen the new Coca-Cola? It's only 90 calories. It's just a real little can. Not because it's low calorie. You know, low calorie, that's good. Why?
I'm telling them, in case they didn't know, there's a lot of newbies in the room that you're addicted.
No. Okay, one, I appreciate
The first step is admitting you have a problem.
the fact, oh, no. I don't have. This is an important thing. She brought up an important point. One, I do really like Coca-Cola. And you can't come up, send me the articles. You know what Coke does?
It didn't matter.
Companies use Coca-Cola to clean their engines. You know, to clean their batteries. You can put, if you put a nail in there, that means it's very powerful. And when I drink it, it'll kill every disease on the land. Just make sure.
So to buy log, bring him an ice cold Coke and bar.
Yes, yeah.
Just
And
FYI.
if you want to add to it, go popcorn. would be good.
But yeah, I forgot popcorn as well.
But the key is, I like it. I'm not addicted. And if you ever want to visit with Jan Ritchie, who's down in our office.
Yes.
Several years ago, she was accusing me. She said, Bob, you're addicted to it. That's an addiction. I said, no, she's proven. I went an entire year, 1 year, without any Coca-Cola, any soda, any of that, for a year. And I missed it.
What was your demeanor? Just curious.
You know what? Everybody say, you're going to get sick. You're going to have health benefits, things happen. I lost weight. I lost weight. That was all. I just missed it. It didn't affect me otherwise at all. I just especially when I had Mexican food or a big old cheeseburger, I missed my Coca-Cola. And so that first day, that June 1st of that following into that year, I had both Mexican food and fried cheeseburger and Coca-Cola. Good, because it's so important. There's some restaurants that have fallen to the dark side. Don't have Coca-Cola. They haven't had it because they've been bought.
Yeah.
A lot of hotels are that way. They've been bought. And many times there's a good restaurant I would otherwise go to. I don't go to because they don't have Coca-Cola.
I agree with you 100%.
That's just, how that kind of it is. But so I do enjoy it. Do like it a lot. And this is it. I don't drink hard stuff. I don't do any of that other stuff. That's it. Give me one little good bad habit. I don't do the other things. I learned early on in life, talking about addiction. I have a terrible addictive personality. And I knew if I started drinking the hard stuff, I'd be a drunk. I mean, there would be no stopping. And so I just never started. I said, nope, I'm not going to do it at all because I have no ability to not do something that I really enjoy. That's why we have 12 kids. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We'll have 3. So this probably goes right in when Holly says, Bob, we're going to have a class on sexual harassment and all that. Kind of give her a little there to do with it. So we're going to talk about a number of different things, and thank you for, this is a great trend. Great attendance in the class. Thank you for being here. And hello to Zoomers too. Hello, my Zoomer persons. Hello. Wow, this is great. Because in this office, we really pride ourselves on education and training and all those kinds of things. And I do love the contracts, the transaction part. It's almost a hobby for me. Because I don't travel, I don't do a lot of other things, I don't play golf, I read contracts. And I know you read contracts every night when you can't get sleep, I understand that. You say, oh, I want to read a contract. Go away. So we're going to talk about several key topics that I have in the email. You don't have material. You have some more material back here? Were they printing some more? Okay, let me get it quick to make sure. Because they're brave enough to be on the front row. So we're going to talk about some key topics. And one of the things that we do in these classes is we try to focus on what you're dealing with every day. Because we know the concept is that you really tend to not pay attention to something until you're in the middle of it. I use the example that several years ago, I taught a class, it was an hour and a half. It was on 2 addenda, backup contract addendum and sale of the property. The entire class, those 2 addendum, I mean, I really drilled down into them. Because I was on the work lawyer committee when we did some of those and I had some background. So the next day after that class, one of the agents came up, she said, I got one. I said, what? Backup contract. Wow, what great timing. You were in the class yesterday. Can we go over again? See, she wasn't in the middle of one at that point in time in the class. She had the concept, but there were some blanks she wasn't entirely sure how I'm going to fill this out. So when you're in the middle of it, you tend to relate to it. If you're not in the middle of it, you kind of say, well, that's a good concept. I'll see if I can't remember it past today. And that's human nature. That's just how that works. And I understand. So we're trying to deal with things that we keep in the call zone, that you keep dealing with, so we can address those. And we're always open to you adding things to it. Say, okay, that's great, but can we talk about this, whatever that is? So you've got the paper there, right? We're talking about the advanced contract, some of the things we're talking about. One of the things that we keep dealing with is the concept of terminating the contract. And within the contract and several addenda, there are rights of termination or conditions that create a termination. In one of them, sale of property addendum, there's a date in there. When that date hits, it's not a right of termination. It's somewhere where the buyer, if the buyer doesn't waive it or satisfy that contingency, it automatically terminates. So they don't make the decision to terminate, it's an automatic happen. And so when we get the phone calls, and we do on a very regular basis, plus as we get some of the calls on the agent hotline. So Marcia, are you on the hotline? Are you on the thing here?
She's up there.
Okay, so she gets some of these things, she gets her phone calls, as do the other 3 agents who, and I would really encourage you to make use of the agent hotline. So when you have contract questions, transaction questions, they're available. These are for experienced agent. And most of the time, certainly easily 80% of the time, they can answer the question, or if not, they'll know where to send you. They send it to me because it's at a little different level. And not because I'm any smarter than anybody on the hotline. I just have more experience. Sometimes you'll come up with something and I'll say, yeah, here's what we do, because we had it last week. And some of the things we're going to talk about, we brought up and we're dealing with it. The option fee thing, because we just had situations last week. They brought up things that we never thought about before. The other thing, so we'll talk about these termination. By the way, if you're not really spending any time in my class, I want you to feel very comfortable asking questions, giving comments, because that's how we learn from each other. Everybody's got a different set of experiences. And one of my beliefs is that every transaction you do changes what you do in the next transaction. As you learn from it, and you're just going to move forward and do something a little different next time. There's some things you thought, and I would never think about that. We had a transaction Lakeside on Preston, big house. And seller took all the light bulbs. Hey, they're not attached, unscripted, gone. And it was a battle between the buyer and the seller, and we tried to stay out of. And the agent, our buyer's agent, said, I would never have thought about saying anything in the contract about the light bulbs. But I mean, that was a lot of light bulbs. Big expensive house, that was a lot. It was a lot of money. So she said, in the future, houses like this, I'm going to address the light bulbs. I want to make sure we're clear. Here's what we're going to do. So, you'll learn from them and you'll kind of go forward. And we hadn't either. We hadn't thought about light bulb. We hadn't thought to tell the seller, you're going to leave the light bulbs, aren't you? Because we want to give them the idea of, oh, you take it. It's good to know that. It's good. I don't know. I don't know if we'll walk through it. Sometimes, depending on when you walk through, we like to walk through as close to closing as possible. And I'm glad you brought up the walkthrough. One of your absolute requirements, and there's several, this is one of them. You have to, never an exception, in writing, such as an email, tell your buyer they should have a re-inspection done and a walkthrough prior to closing. They don't have to do that. You have to advise them. Don't ever let it happen that you didn't advise them in writing. You got the documentation. So later, when it hits the fan, and it will, and they say, well, you never told me. Yeah, I did. It was the email. Here's your acknowledgement. Here's your reply to the email in which I advise you to do this as you work through it. So
And when they ask, and why do we need to do that? What do you suggest?
Okay, good question. So they say, why should we do it? I said, well, you've done your due diligence to make sure the property is what it's supposed to be and the condition is supposed to be for you to pay what you're paying for.
Right.
And you're gonna go to a closing, you're gonna bring money. But if you don't look at the house from the day you enter into the contract, you don't go over to the house after any inspections, how are you gonna know it's what it's supposed to be, what you're paying for? No way for you to know. That's an important due diligence, because the biggest lawsuits, the most common lawsuits are buyers suing the sellers after closing. Because the seller either failed to disclose or misrepresented something. Most of that's related to the seller's disclosure notice. And if a buyer has gone through their due diligence, checked everything out prior to closing, they're in a better position to say, you know what? This is what was going on at closing. This is what you didn't tell us about. This is what, now, once we've moved in, we've found all this. You got to do that. If you don't do that, how do you know what you're buying? It's just like people have bought and closed on houses sight unseen. And they get to do that. We have a form where we want the buyer to sign off on. It's an advisory form that says, you know, if you're buying a house, closing on sight unseen, here are your risks. They get to do that. We don't get to have them do it, not know we've advised. It's like a buyer doesn't have to do an inspection. We have an advisory form saying, hey, this is all on our intranet. Hey, here's why you should do an inspection. Here's why you might want to think about a survey. Here's why you might want to think about a title policy. The cash transaction, we have buyers say, I don't need a survey. I don't need this. I don't need that. Say, okay, fine. You get to make that decision. But here's why we think you should. Here's why we think you should do these things. And that's a great question because you need to have a script. You need to know when you say, here's what you really, really need to do. They say, why? That's a reasonable response from them. So you need to know, here's why. Does that make sense? How you would do that? You want to follow up to that? So, right. We good?
Well, yeah, I think we're good. Just, let's say something happens and it isn't to the quality or the standard that they wanted. Then do they go back to the table or?
This is a really important part of this question. They do a reinspection. And what they're re-inspecting for, two things. One, repairs that are agreed to as a result of an inspection. And only an inspector or someone at that level, not you, can determine if repairs are done in the manner that's been agreed to in the contract. Paragraph 7 of the contract, it was been done in that manner. Second is, they want to make sure when they enter into a contract with the seller, buyer and seller enter into a contract, and in paragraph 10 of the contract, the seller delivers possession of the property to the buyer in its present condition, which is the day the buyer and seller enter a contract. So everything that was there on that day, it's not excluded in paragraph 2D. Everything that was working that wasn't addressed in one of the other paragraphs contract has to be there, has to be working when they close. How in the world could you know that if you don't do a reinspection, if you don't go through, do a walkthrough? So you go through those situations and you do it. And so what happens? So when you do that, go through the process and they find something that to say, hey, you know what? This isn't working. Let's say they do a walkthrough and they find out that the AC is not working now. And maybe the AC was not part of anything showed up in the inspection. And maybe the AC, problem with the AC, it wasn't a repair request. So now, as they're doing a walkthrough, you know, it sure seems warm in here. The air conditioning's not working. Shouldn't the air conditioner be working? Well, the reason we think it was working on the day the buyer and seller entered a contract is it was working when the buyer had their inspection done. And that's going to be the buyer's proof that, yeah, it was working then, so it needs to be working, seller, when you deliver this to us. That's going to be your documentation again. Otherwise, you don't have anything to say. They say, oh, you know, I don't know what you're saying. Correct, it hadn't worked once. But, you know, we just went through a winter, so we didn't really know it wasn't working. So we didn't disclose it wouldn't work. We didn't know.
Is it just that simple? Then, okay, if the air conditioner doesn't work,
Okay.
just fix it or do we have?
Well, no, what the buyer has to do is then make a decision. The buyer said, you know what, air conditioner not work. They've got to determine, was it working before? That's when the buyer looks at their inspection report. You should already have had a conversation with the buyer in the inspection whether or not AC was working, not working. Temperature differentials, all that, and have made a request to the seller. So that's going to be part of the conversation. If the buyer has determined that made a repair request because inspector found that there were problems with the AC. Now the buyer says, you know what, you agreed in this repair amendment to make sure these things were taken care of with the AC. They haven't been taken care of. As we've had a re-inspection, the inspector who went out and checked this, no, still have these wrong temperature differentials, pressure's not working, you know, whatever it might be. So then the buyer has to make a decision. Seller, you agreed to do this, and in the contract itself, paragraph 7, you agreed to do this, you were prior to closing, you haven't. So the buyer's got to decide, we're going to either delay closing, and you have automatic rights to delay closing 7 days, work through that. Or we're not going to close on the contract till you get this fixed, or we want all our money back. Because you do what you agreed to is performance. Now, anytime you have a performance issue, that's attorney time. When your buyer says, I think, seller, I think you're obligated to do this and you're not doing it, you haven't done it. I think you have to do it. And if you don't do it, I'm not going to close. The buyer does that under advice of counsel, not under advice of real estate. Anytime you've got a client for whatever reason, this is where we get into some of these termination rights. Anytime you have a client for whatever reason who's not going to perform, they need to do that under advice of counsel. It's one of those things, and I'm surprised because I'll get the call from some seasoned, experienced agents who say, Bob and seller decide they're not going to close. What do we do? It's not a good question. Your automatic response to your seller is, always is, you need to seek legal advice on your rights and responsibilities under the terms of the contract. If you're not going to perform under the terms of the contract, you need to do that under advice of legal counsel, not under advice of real estate agent. I mean, these automatically be, now there are always layers of all kinds of things that can happen. That can, seller, all kinds of things that can happen. The seller can't close, can't do things that happen. It could be a divorce situation when you know about a state situation, and I know that there's deals with some of those kinds of things. But in your first blush, your first response in here when they say, I'm not going to close. Say, okay. And you might softly, depending on the relationship, all these other things on it. First, advice of counsel. Second, you do realize my commission under the listing agreements are earning payable, you still owe. If you close or not, you still owe me my commission. And they do. It's earning payable. But that comes with some really strange reasons why it's not. So sometimes when you add that other reason in there, and you're thinking they're not going to close, there's no big deal. I give the buyer their money back or whenever you're past it. Well, you can get the buyer their money back. You need to pay us that $11,000 in commission. And say, oh, well, maybe I do here and then sell. You had a question, follow up question, what you said.
Yes, well, because when you said the word reinspection, does that,
Reinspection.
does that mean it's just you, the buyer, and your agent, or you want to bring someone
It's
professional?
actually, generally, the best thing is going to be the inspector who originally inspected the property. They're going to charge less to do a reinspection. Where do you guys find it? Is it $100?
Believe that.
Huh?
It depends on how clean it was to begin with.
Sure, okay, yeah, what kind of inspection report originally had. And by the
Or
way,
how good a relationship you have with your inspector.
yeah, absolutely, that's true, you give them a lot of business.
You get a better deal.
Yeah, and let me clarify, it's never you. You don't have the ability to do a reinspection. You don't have to have the ability just like to do the original inspection. You don't have the ability to go through and do a walkthrough in place of your client. Say, yeah, everything's looking good. You don't get to do that. They have to do it, or they have to have someone else do it. It can't be you. Because you miss anything at all. Oh yeah, I was standing out there and looking, yeah, it looks like a new roof to me. That's your roof. That's now your roof. That's our roof. And when the lawsuit hits, that's both of us. Oh, Sally and then, okay, Sally?
Is there a statute of limitations on? We
Statute of limitations on what? Against us?
against, we had the buyer
Okay, them to
and
file
5
suit?
years ago, and they called last night and said, or sent a text and said, we think there's something maybe wrong with the roof. Could you dig out the seller's disclosure?
Okay.
5 years ago.
Okay, good. So roof's a great example, by the way. So 5 years ago, closing on a transaction, you have the buyer, and that's 5 years later and say, we think there are problems with the roof. And we want you to pull out seller's disclosure, see if seller's anything. You have to keep all documents related to transaction are tracked for 4 years. Our policy is 5 years. So you probably would have all that.
I do have it. I just.
And so you have the obligation, you have really part of your duty is to provide to that buyer any documents you have in your possession that would help them. So you provide that. What you also have to make clear to them, this is a buyer-seller issue. Now, the statute of limitations probably is under the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, and that's a moving 2 years. It's a 2-year time frame, but it's moving. And it's 2 years from when they knew about it or should have known about it. We've had cases in which they've lived in a house for 5 years and they've never been into the attic. Now they've been to the attic and discover problems. Well, they just now discovered it, so their 2-year time frame just started. So it depends on some other things involved as whether or not the statute of limitation hits or not. And by the way, it's not your determination whether or not the time, has passed or not, but say, okay, there are a lot of factors here. One, buyer seller issue, 2, advice of counsel. Now, you need to get good at the script for advice of counsel. Just like you need to be good at the script of sending them to another roofer or plumber or whatever. Because if you keep sending them somewhere else, at some point in time, you say, Bob, we're kind of open to you knowing something. Do you know something? You keep sending us everywhere else. You need to make sure you've got a good script on. Here's why. It's not good service to your client for you to give your opinion about the roof. Because on your license, you look salesperson, comma, roofer, comma, you don't have other stuff on there. You don't get to do that. It's bad service because when you start doing that kind of thing, just like if they feel like you have really recommended a certain inspector, they look to us as the safety net. In case anything goes wrong, we're kind of going to take care of it. They can't do that. We're not the safety net. We've got liability if they feel like that's our inspector and our lender and our title company and so forth. But you can't do that. You work through the process. It's something as simple as roofers. Texas doesn't license roofers. Manufacturers do. Manufacturers of the material approve or license roofers to put on their materials on roof. And so in Texas, it's the manufacturer. So it's got to be a roofer who's approved or licensed by the manufacturers of the material, the roofing material. Well, as an agent, you should know that to the point that, I'm not going to have a conversation about what's valid or not valid or whatever, but here's how this works in Texas. You need to have a little bit of a sense of things that are not licensed in Texas. That people think, well, gee, it seemed like that ought to be licensed. Foundation companies are not licensed in Texas. Roofers are not licensed in Texas. Sheetrock, you got to replace a whole wall, not licensed in Texas. Primarily it's areas like plumbing, electrical, and there's a certification dealing with HVAC. So you need to have a sense of those and know, here's kind of what you need to check on to kind of deal through. Not because you're an expert in those areas, but you need to have a little bit of a sense of this is kind of how that works. Now, I have a question here.
This was kind of a combo question on both option period and commission. That just came to my head. We had a sale, I represented the seller at a $1.6 million sale where the seller asked the buyer to put up a $50,000 non-refundable option. And he did. If he backed out, would that commission?
Non-refundable option, not earnest.
Earnest money, excuse me.
Okay.
Earnest money, yeah. So if he
So
backed
you have the
out,
seller,
I represented the seller.
and so hopefully an attorney drew up that language.
You
Not
know
an
what,
agent.
yeah, what we got is the language from our attorney
Okay,
to put in there.
and instruction from your seller to use that language.
Mhm,
Good,
mhm.
good.
Yeah. So would commissions still be, let's say he did not back out, but if he backed out,
Yeah, in the listing agreement, there's a paragraph that if the seller receives earnest money or damages as a result of a transaction, we have a right to half of that, amount of our commission, half our commission, whichever is less. So we actually had that protection in the listing agreement.
good to know. Thank you.
I had another one over here. Yes, ma'am.
So is it the money, the 50,000 earnest money that she would get paid the commission from in that?
If they receive the earnest money,
And it gotta be before closing too. I mean, if she collected that money
yeah,
before.
if they collect that money in terms of this one, we have a right
Okay.
up to the amount of half of that, to the amount of our commission, whichever is less. So we have some rights. And so we've got some protection because the list agreement we use with the Texas Rubber List Agreement We wrote it, we as realtors. And it's actually, you would think it means it's like a builder's contract where it's written totally in favor of the builder. It's not, it's a really fair contract. It's got some really important things. For example, a protection period. If you agree to terminate the contract or the contract or the listing agreement or listing agreement expires, you've got a protection period. If the seller lists his property with another realtor, protection period goes away. No longer applies. Because we can't put a seller in a position of owing two brokers a commission. That's for their protection. So we've got some things in there that are for their benefit as you work through that. They're not totally one-sided. Good questions. Okay, so let's talk about the terminations. Because, you know, we have so many situations where depending on what's going on in the transaction, you may have some termination, the buyer may have some termination rights that not only does the buyer have to be aware of as it impacts on what they're going to do in the transaction, but the seller needs to be aware that there are circumstances where the buyer could terminate the contract and move on. Because sometimes sellers saying, yeah, we're gonna make out like a bandit here, and if they don't close, I get all that earnest money. Maybe not any of it as you work through it. So on this first page here, I talk about some of the rights of termination. I'll give you some examples. What I've got there. You know, the big one is the option period, which is paragraph 5. Obviously, it deals with the earnest money. 5D deals with the option. 5A talks about the option fee, talks about the money. That's the only unrestricted right to terminate anywhere in the contract or addendum contract. What that means is not only does the buyer not have to have any reason to do it, they don't need the seller's permission. It's the very first choice on the correct promulgated buyer's notice termination contract. Very first choice, and that form is only signed by the buyer. You don't need any permission from the seller. Many, but not all, many title companies, if the buyer terminates during the option period, and once the title company proves up, they've terminated appropriately within the option period, they pay the option fee. The option fee is cleared the bank. The earnest money is cleared the bank. As long as that's all happened, and there are many title companies who won't require the seller to sign off on a release of earnest money because it's an unrestricted right to terminate and you cannot tie any restriction. Now, not all title companies agree with that. Some title companies say any dispute, any situation, want everybody to sign off. Very unhappy with those folks. That's the most powerful right of termination. We're going to talk in a few minutes later about some things that have happened that we're now dealing with in paragraph 5 and dealing with some ambiguous language that we really hadn't noticed before, but it's now things have happened that cause us to be aware of it. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. So that's one termination right. The one that's almost as powerful is dealing with paragraph 7B2, deals with the seller's disclosure notice. If at the time the buyer and seller have entered into a contract, the buyer does not have seller's disclosure notice, and 7B2 is checked off, and that says the buyer doesn't have it. Then once the buyer receives it, they have 7 days to terminate for any reason. Doesn't have to be a reason specific to the seller's disclosure notice. It's totally tied to the receipt or non-receipt of the seller's disclosure notice. So 7 days or closing, whichever comes first. You don't get to extend the closing for the 7 days. So if you finally get the seller's disclosure notice 1 day before closing, ours got 1 day. That's powerful. It's just like, frankly, it's very much like the option provision. The only reason it's not unrestricted is tied to the receipt of information. It's a very powerful right of termination. So if you got the seller, don't let your seller enter into a contract. Well, probably best if you're going to counter and it comes in an offer with 7B2, make sure you send that seller's disclosure notice to the buyer very quickly, to the buyer's agent, and have 7B2 checked to change to 7B1. So the buyer now has a seller's disclosure notice and you've taken away that powerful right of termination.
What if the seller's disclosure is not completely filled out?
Okay, so one of the challenges with seller's disclosure notice, her question was, I need to repeat this because not all the Zoom folks can hear everybody. So she asked, what if the seller's disclosure notice is not completed? Do you represent the buyer or the seller?
The buyer.
Okay. one of your obligations as a buyer's agent is when you receive the seller disclosure notice, review it for completeness. You don't review it for accuracy, because you don't have any way to determine that. But for completeness, if it's not completed, there are blanks in there, things that the seller just didn't check off or whatever, which is silly because the way the questions are asked and the choices in there, they can always say unknown or you say not aware. So there's no reason for them not to do it. Want that out to your buyer and see what your buyer wants to do. Buyer says, you know what, if I can't get everything from them, I'm not going to do the deal. In today's market, with the limited inventory and the way buyers are so desperate to get their deal, they probably say, you know what, we're going to do an inspection anyway. We don't really care. We're going to move forward. They should care, but because the seller's disclosure notice is an important document, is what the buyer can hold the seller to. Buyer can say, here's what you said, and here's why we feel like you have misrepresented or failed to disclose things, because here's what we now know, here's what we think you knew, and you didn't disclose in the seller's disclosure notice. So you can look at it for completeness. Yes, sir, James?
So an incomplete disclosure notice is considered delivered, even though it's incomplete.
Okay, so it's a good question. And what James asked is, so a seller disclosure notice that's not complete or was delivered, is that still considered a valid seller disclosure notice? That's a legal issue. We can't get the attorneys to agree on that. And that's a challenge. You don't get to make a decision. You know what? It's not complete, so it's not even a valid seller disclosure notice. So buyer, I wouldn't even accept it. I'd say to them, hey, you still have to complete this, still have to give me one. That's going to be a buyer's decision. And when they talk to an attorney, it's going to depend on which group of attorneys they talk to. Even in Texas, even TR, I can get all of them on the same page. You got whole kinds of areas like that. Because they're, and when I talked to one of my good trick attorneys, said, Bob, you know, there are a lot of layers to that. There are a lot of variables. There are a lot of factors. So I can't give you a broad answer here because it really depends. There's so many things here that's I you tell me you're not going to give me an answer. Okay, fine. And they don't. You know, the thing I love about even good trick attorneys is make it clear they don't represent us. They don't represent you. They're not giving you a legal opinion. They're quoting the rules. And that's what they do. That's why you've got all those rules and tracking, you've got the Rural Set License Act. So that's what you're going to do is they work through that.
Do you get extension days if it's not completed?
Well, if the buyer makes the determination that they haven't received it at all, then the buyer's also deciding, I've still got that 7 days when I finally receive it, but I haven't received it yet. Now, what it's going to take is the buyer to make that decision. But right now, the buyer's got, if buyer has 7B2 in the contract, then that still applies. But it's going to be the buyer having to make a decision, hopefully under advice of counsel. And you know what? I don't think I've been given a seller disclosure because it's not complete. And there are all kinds of ranges of not complete. But every question in the seller disclosure notice gives the buyer the option in section 1, yes, no, unknown. And the other awareness questions, you know, I'm not aware, yes, I'm aware, I'm not aware. So there's nothing in there that's even a clueless seller can at least say, I don't know. I'm clueless, I don't know. So there's always something that they put in there. And if they don't, the buyer's got to make a decision. What we're gonna do here. Yes, ma'am.
What if the seller knows that she's done a foundation repair?
Uh-huh.
However, she could not find the receipt of that, but then of course she will, you know, market that
Yeah.
she knows it. But what's?
Okay, so good question. The question is seller has done foundation work. Can't find the receipt for it. It's not unusual. But then in the seller disclosure, they disclose that they've done it. And whatever they can remember from it, had it done by such company, such time frame, can't find my receipt. There's nothing in the seller disclosure notice that requires that documentation. It requires disclosure. And the risk you have is buyers say, well, what are you hiding here? You know, you say you had it done by such a, of course, the buyer can always call that company, see if they're still in business and see if they have some records or whatever of it, if they're going to enter into the contract. But yeah, you know, this most important thing that we do, buying a house, remember closing what you got, that package of all those important papers, and where'd you put them? In the important paper place. You have no idea where it is. You know it's safe, wherever it is. And 10 years later, when you need all that stuff, there's no way you can't find it. And that's really important stuff. And we should have all that information. But human nature, we just don't do it. So seller disclosure notice, big deal as you work through that. So good questions. The right to terminate based on non-receipt of subdivision information established in paragraph A1, A2, and A3 of the mandatory HOA addendum. I hope I don't have to say those three are mutually exclusive. Only check one. You can't check A1 and A3, and A1 and A2, and A2 and A3. You certainly can't check A4 and any one of the A1, A2, A3 as you look at HOA addendum, because those are different choices. A1 is the most common choice where buyer says to the seller, you need to provide the subdivision information. When you provide it, I have 3 days after receiving it to terminate for any reason or closing, whichever comes first. In A2, we have buyer has certain rights, and A2 deals with the seller requiring the buyer to obtain a subdivision information provided to the seller. And there's certain termination rights here. And A3 deals with an updated resale certificate and certain termination rights. A4 is where the buyer says, I've already got one, I don't need it, and I have approval. Then you have to make sure in paragraph D of that addendum that you determine if the title company needs a resale certificate, updated resale certificate, who's going to pay for it? Because the title company will require one. So we got to decide at that point in time who's going to pay for it. So the mandatory HOA prior to termination is not based on what's in the subdivision information, including resale certificate. It's a right of termination based on the receipt or non-receipt of the information, which for any reason. And by the way, when you receive that subdivision information and all that stuff in there, that the HOA is saying here's what you can do and can't do, you are not allowed to review it and interpret it and advise on it. It's not a TREC form. Don't have the right to do that. It's practicing law without a license. Yes, ma'am.
If I represent the buyer, if the buyer wants this house to be a investment.
Investor property.
Invest property, so how could we get the information about this HOA? Is it could rent?
Okay, so the question is, Sue's got a buyer, is buying this as an investment. And she wants to know, how does the buyer find out if they can use it as an investment? The buyer contacts the HOA. Buyer reads the documents and the buyer determines if they find something in there. Most importantly, the buyer talks to the HOA. Says, do you have any rules against investment owners? Most of them have some kind of a percentage. If we can't have more than 30% or whatever percentage of non-owner occupants. Not owners who are not occupied. But they need to find out the HOA. Now, if you call the HOA and get the information and give it to your buyer and you're wrong, you're liable. We had one. We had the buyer, our agent had the buyer, find it as investment. Thought it was okay. Agent thought it was okay, closed on it. Discovered in one of the rules on about 30 pages into the information was that you had to own the property for 1 year before you could rent it out. So we had a year's worth of cost for the buyer owning that property before you could rent it out. And fortunately, we had a buyer who understood, said, you know what, I reviewed it, I should have known better. And we split the cost with him, but we had half of the cost for him owning that property for a year. Because we should have totally just stepped back and said, hey, you know what, do it. You take care of it. You gotta be very careful. That makes good sense?
Hey, Bob.
Yeah, question.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
So we've had some discussion about whether or not the buyer can terminate on the HOA contingency if they haven't received the HOA documents.
Okay, so her question is, and it's interesting, I addressed this in a recent class over CCAR. In the HOA addendum, it has, if you use A1, it has a blank for a number of days that the buyer is requiring the seller to deliver the subdivision information, including resale certificate. And so the question came up, does the buyer have to give the seller that number of days to provide it? And once the seller has provided it, or once that number of days has passed, then the buyer can terminate the contract. And every attorney who I've talked to, all the respective attorneys who I've talked to, said the buyer has to give the seller that number of days. They can't terminate until that number of days has passed. I've found enough title companies that agree with all of those attorney opinions. So what we've got to do as best practices is when we've got the buyer and we put those number of days in there, we've got to recognize that a buyer's rights of termination of the HOA addendum under paragraph A1 are going to be tied to that number of days. Now, having said that, the practical side of that, I mean, let's say you've got 15 days in there. You don't want to hit a rush fee, so you got 15 days. 5 days into the deal, we're past an option, past other things. Maybe the only termination that the buyer still has left is the HOA. Buyer says, well, I'm going to terminate. And looking, he says, well, you know, technically, you're gonna have to wait those 15 days. Buyer says, okay, so make sure your seller understands what's about to happen. Your seller wants to hold the house off the market for another 10 days. And not stop knowing that I'm going to terminate and not buy the house. Does he really want to hold it off the market for another 10 days? Or does he want to let it go? Practical side is he's going to let it go. I have no rationale for why the seller would say, okay, let's wait 15 days. You're going to terminate anyway, go ahead and terminate. We'll move forward. And most of the time, by the way, even though that's kind of the rule that's been explained to us, if your buyer terminates and you really haven't passed that number of days, most of the time that's accepted because the seller said, hey, they're going to go away. They're going to terminate whether it's now or 10 days from now. They're terminating, so let's let them go and get into a contract with the buyer is going to close. Does that semi-answer that? Kind of?
Yes, yes, sir.
Good. So HOA is well, one of the things we are doing, by the way, and we'll do maybe that's on the class we've got a class on the 29th here. We may talk some more about some of those challenges, best practices and looking at, because it's common we're using paragraph A1, buyer has seller delivery, but paragraph A2 and A3 of the HOA addendum are really good paragraphs. We need to consider maybe making use of those more than the easy A1 because that's accepted. Everybody does. We'll talk about that more in class. And then the next one is the right to terminate under paragraph B1B, paragraph B4 of the addendum regarding residential leases. You need to be comfortable, well, comfortable may be too strong a word, you at least need to be aware of the provisions of those two new addendums that just came out last year, one dealing with residential leases and the other dealing with fixture leases. So residential leases means the property is currently, the seller is in a lease with someone who's not a party to contract, written lease. And that addendum addresses that, and addresses whether or not the buyer is going to go ahead and assume that lease, or whether the buyer wants to terminate it, or wants to only close it vacant. The choice is in there. And some of those choices, if the seller hasn't provided the information to the buyer, buyer's termination rights. You need to be familiar with what's going on in that addendum. Same thing with the fixture lease addendum. You need to be comfortable with the fact that it's got choices in there where a buyer gets to decide, yeah, I'll assume that lease on the fixture, or I won't assume that lease, or I want that fixture out of here, I want it gone. And you got lots of variables in there, whether or not there is a lease or whether or not it's owned and financed. You don't use that addendum if it's owned and financed. You don't use that addendum if it's leased. If you've got the seller, he has some fixture leases. He needs to talk to the lessor on that and knows whether that can be assumed and what conditions can be assumed. All those things, you need to really have that. The great thing about that new paragraph 4 that deals with the leases, these are things we already should have been talking about with our clients. And we're talking about them now because they're in the contract. And so you need to be really familiar with the termination right, because in both residential lease addendum and the fixed lease addendum, there are rights of termination that you need to be familiar with that are going to impact. So your seller certainly needs to know by not getting this information to the buyer right up front. So he can check off that box on the addendum, buyer has termination rights. The seller may say, you know what? I don't want that. I don't want him to have an extra termination. He's got enough in the contract anyway. But sometimes there's a sense that these aren't worth anything because the buyer just walk away for any reason. Not true. There are a lot of reasons where they can't. You work through it. So on those two, that's the same thing. And the next thing about rights under B2 of the addendum for fixture leases, just make sure that we're using the addendum for fixture leases, it truly is a lease. And if you address fixture leases and the buyer said, I'm not going to assume the lease, I want that stuff out of here. There's a place in that addendum that addresses the seller's responsibility for any damages or anything that may happen as a result of removing that. And the worst case scenario is the problem one we have the most problems with are solar panels. They can remove the solar panels And then you have all kinds of potential roof problems. So the buyer may want to have additional language that helps him work through. Those are two important addendums that you really should be able to address and be able to deal with that. Yes, question. Yes,
I
ma'am.
have an issue with going to 4A, whether it is a written lease or a verbal one, you should still check 4A. Title attorneys came back and we had to amend it because it's a month-to-month verbal agreement. The way they see it is you're paying money to the seller, so that is an implied agreement. So whether it's oral, it is, you
Okay,
still
so
need to check off for
This
it.
brings up, this is a good example of dealing with attorneys. And we always are respectful of attorneys' opinions. Because, and if you ever question this, ask them, they know a lot more than we do. I said that with a straight face, now work, yeah, but we do, and it depends on the attorney, depends on if they're a good real estate attorney. There is actually language that deals with month to month as opposed to written leases. But you're right, many times you'll find in the sellers don't pass the expiration of the written lease and they're in a month to month. Okay, did that just happen? Oh yeah, 3 years ago. They've been in a month to month for 3 years.
Yes, 20.
And so, yeah, right. In fact, they may never have had a written lease, And so the attorney says there's probably enough of a landlord-tenant relationship there to prove that it has to be addressed. And that's probably right. It's better to be safe because one thing you want to avoid is any dispute. You have something like that where someone says, well, technically it doesn't apply because it's just a month to month. I say, well, all right, I gotta make a decision. What am I going to do? Am I going to close with that tenant? It's kind of month to month in there. And then I've got to worry about getting them out. Because what we do understand that if you're not in a written and if you're in month to month, in Texas, you've got a 30-day termination right. So, the seller, the landlord, or the tenant can give notice for 30 days for the termination of that month to month. And they probably are in some kind of a holding over period from their time of the original lease. So that can be a challenge, and it points out an important thing that there are a lot of variables in this. Because, it's don't let your buyer close on a piece of property where there's a tenant in it and not understand their new obligations. And one of their new obligations is they're now responsible for any security deposit. They better get that at closing. That's what that addendum does for it. It actually states the amount in there. So we know what that is. Because all of a sudden, when they go through the process and say, well, and now on the property, they send that notice to the tenant, says, oh, great, you know what? I'm glad the seller had told me as soon as you took over that I can go ahead and move out. And I need that $3,000 deposit so I can move. What $3,000? And it's amazing how often people don't remember the deposit. It's been a long time. The deposit was made or not made. The buyer's pretty clear. They made a deposit for $5,000. They first leased the property 5 years ago. Who knows where that is now? So that's a little challenge. That's why we do what you're just doing. We always, rely on good attorneys. We like to talk to good real estate attorneys. One of the things that we've discovered though, we talked about this option thing in a few minutes. I had to talk to 3 good, well-respected attorneys, at least respected by me, to get close to the same answer, but not exactly the same. So you always like to back it up when you talk to a good attorney, talk to Dylan Milligan, Charles Kramer, Don Moore, people like that. It's good to have it backed up with another opinion because, and the best example, the late David Fair, was great. Wonderful. David was on the very first corporation. Back when I first started way back when. And David was always great, gave it great opinions, and he was always available to us. And when you ask him a good question, David did the thing that not all attorneys do and all attorneys should do. He said, Bob, that's my opinion. I feel pretty good about that opinion in court, but it's my opinion. Another attorney might have a different opinion. He almost certainly would. So we need to be okay with attorney saying, yeah, here's the rule. Say, okay, that's your rule. See what somebody else's rule is. And that's why we like to have our clients, when they get legal advice, have them talk to as you work through it. And when you get that good information, you say, okay, here's what attorney A said. let's see what Attorney B said. There's almost not anything in the contract. But I can't find a whole room full of attorneys over here to take a position and another room full of attorneys over here to take another position. That's the nature of law. Yes, ma'am.
With regard to the attorneys, is this like also like another vendor that we need to build that business relationship with, or is that them finding their own?
Okay, good question. So the question that she has is, these attorneys are these vendors that we have relationships with? And if you're going to send them names of attorneys, make sure they've signed our vendor statement of policy form. It's like we give them names of inspectors, whatever. We've got a number of attorneys that we have a relationship with, that they've actually represented us, represent our office, represent, other clients of ours, who are happy for us to refer business to them. Depending on the nature of what's going on, they probably will, in fact, charge them something, depending on what's going on. But we've got several, and I've got several attorneys that if you send, hey, I've got this situation. It'll depend a little bit on what the issue is. One of the attorneys I have is board certified for construction law and things like that. So, if you had a builder situation, he might be a good attorney for that.
Okay.
Another one, it might be a title issue. We've got several good title attorneys. So yeah, we're happy to, when we send them that, we say, here's some names. Give them a call and say who you like, who you talk to. One of the things that they need to understand, those are not our attorneys. We don't have an attorney for our office that's representing the dog. Have to do that. But we're happy. I think that if your buyer or your seller needs to talk to an attorney, you say, hey, that's what Google is for. Google them up. I think that's a disservice. I think they have a right to benefit from our sets of experiences. We need to be able to say, but I'm not referring them. I'm not recommending, I'm not endorsing them, and you're not. I'm saying, here's something that we've had a good experience with. Give them a call, talk to them. One of the ones that I often send his name out is Robert Miller. He's with Prager Miller. He's actually representing our office in a number of situations, lawsuit with me, and things like that. So we've got good experience with him. Chase Garrett, who's an individual with a small firm, is a good attorney, and he deals a lot with individual agents and their clients. And he's good. He's a good real estate attorney. So we've got some that we've had experience with, and we're happy to give some of those names. We want to avoid giving one name, saying here's one to use, because if they get one name, they're kind of say, oh, well, that's who you've recommended. That's who you've endorsed. And we can't have them walk away thinking that. Can I help? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
I need to continue down there. So we talked about the option, which is that independent consideration as you work through it, what the other two are. One thing you need to understand, I talked about in the next last paragraph on page 1, is that one gets confused sometimes. How you doing, Tommy? Thank you for coming. Yes, sir. Okay. Tommy Thompson loves Coca-Cola and popcorn. That's the case because he brings me some on a regular basis. And I like that. So these rights of termination, all are independent. None of them are tied to any of the others. So you may have an HOA right of termination. You may have a self-disclosure right of termination. You may have the termination option in paragraph 5, and they're all independent. None stack on top of others. None relate to the others. They all stand on their own. So you need to be comfortable with that as you work through. The thing I mentioned at the very bottom is the termination option. Say the option to terminate that. That's tied to the effective date. However, and I go into the next page, the amended effective date. And then I talk a little bit about in the contract, some timelines, in fact, most of the timelines are tied to the effective date of the contract. Not all. Some are tied to an event. The buyer's right of objection, for example, is a receipt of the commitment exception document servant, not the effective date of the contract. The seller's obligation to deliver title commitment is tied to the title company receiving copy of the contract. So many of them are tied to events. Some of them, like the backup contract and several other in the short sale contract, Both of those have the potential for an amended effective date. The backup contract had an original effective date when the backup contract was accepted as a binding contract, but it's subject to the existence of a first contract. If the first contract goes away and the backup becomes the new first contract, that date that happened is the amended effective date. And all the timelines in the contract that are tied to the effective date are now tied to the amended effective date. The option period, for example, while the right of termination started from the beginning on the backup contract, the option period itself didn't start until the amended effective. And it actually states that in the backup contract addendum. So it's valuable for you to have a sense of, in working, dealing with the timelines, which ones are tied to the effective date of the contract, which ones are tied to some other event you work through. I'll give you an example there on page 2. Those are 8 items in there. And these are all items that are tied to the effective date of the contract. So we'll have those, and if you have any questions or anything, you can sort of actually talk about it. Then we talk about the timelines tied to events, which I mentioned several of these here on page 3. These are things that are tied to events. The reason it's important on these, all that you do in these terminations, any contingency that creates a right of termination or creates a condition that terminates a contract, before that happens, you have to give your client, your buyer, notice. And that's the easy thing is the option. You got a 10-day option period. And the 10th day of the 10-day option period is about to come up. You've got to send an email to your buyer and say, your right of termination based on the termination option, paragraph 5, ends tomorrow at 5 p.m. But you need to know that powerful right of termination is about to go away. And that's the greatest leverage you have for terminating and getting out of the contract. You need to be aware of it. Same thing when the addendum hits on buyer approval and third-party financial addendum, or the HOA addendum, any other right of termination of this on the addendum prior page. When that's about to hit, they need to know that. For example, in the third-party financing addendum in paragraph B2 that talks about property approval, you're on a conventional loan and you don't have the appraisal yet, and you're coming up pretty close to closing. Your buyer needs to know this contingency, this right of termination based on property approval ends 3rd day prior to closing. So before that hits, they need to know, I can't wait until 1 day or 2 days prior to closing, because then when we get a bad appraisal or something like that, I've lost that right of termination. So that you need to know that timeline. Now, if it's FHA or VA, it goes all the way to closing. So you need to know the timeline for your buyer's termination. Now, there are things they have to do. If they're going to terminate under that provision, they've got to provide something from their lender saying, here's why we don't approve the property. They go through that process. So you need to know those timelines that you're dealing with there. But your buyer, before contingency goes away, before they lose that, they need to have a good sense of it. They need to know that this is about to go away. But when all of a sudden they find out, wow, interest rates just went up again and my ratios have gone crazy and I can no longer obtain approval on my loan, my financing, I guess I get out of the deal. Well, if you're past the number of days in B1 dealing with the buyer approval, no, you just lost that. And so before that timeline hits, that buyer needs to talk to their lender, say, how does my financing look? I'm about to make a decision that takes this contingency away and my earnest money is at risk. So I need to know how you're looking, how I'm looking from a buyer approval standpoint, not the property, but the buyer. And if the buyer's lender said, oh, everything's looking great, we're looking really good, buyer needs to terminate right away. But the lender just said what he thought he wanted to hear and didn't give you any information at all. You're very clear and very specific. Well, it's really good. It's looking really good, but you're self-employed. We still have this tax return we're still looking for. And one more thing, we're going to talk about that in a second with the approvals. Questions on those? We'll go into the approval. Hello, Nick. Being here. This is one of the four persons on the agent hotline. For a good knowledgeable person who will answer questions. Marcia, who was on the Zoom thing earlier, one of the others on there, and Scott Scribner. Just great, and then yeah, good old Joe, New York Joe. So those are the four, and we really appreciate their service and what they're doing. Okay, so yes, ma'am, question.
About 2A, it's buyer proof approval. It's normally when you put it 21 day or a day. If you include this day, the buyer is not approval. How it's our to give the termination or the lender gives the termination.
Okay, so to answer your question, dealing with third-party financing and buyer approval. And so our question becomes, who sends it over? Is it us? Is it the buyer? It's never us. We do it under instruction by our buyer. But if you're doing that, under paragraph 2A, buyer approval, third-party financing, there's no language in here that the buyer has to have the lender produce anything saying, we're not approved. That's the expectation. But under property approval, yes. Under buyer approval, no language in there. Be prepared to deal with it because on a regular basis, listing agents were really fussy. They say, whoa. The only reason my seller took your buyer's offer is you convinced us how strong he was. Buyer approval, not just for buyer approval, solid gold. In fact, we've nominated him for the Borrowers Hall of Fame. He's great. And you really told us, got to take my buyer out here. Now you tell me can't obtain approval. What's on it? Well, I ain't saying it, but the reason Kennedy died. What? They happen. I mean, there are reasons why all of a sudden people get approved. But there is no requirement in paragraph, when you have buyer approval, for them to produce anything from the lender. However, it's not a bad idea to be able to do it. It makes it smoother, makes it easier. Because if there's one termination that I get a lot of flack on, it's the buyer approval. Especially when the seller feels like they got a lot of good information on how good that buyer was financing wise. So that's not an unreasonable thing. Would you agree with that, Nick? I mean, you probably encountered that somewhat.
So you're working with the buyer, best practices, try to get it. You're the seller. Do all your due diligence ahead of time, even if you call the vendor, sometimes they still say they're qualified up front. Because they found a business. They lost a lot of money.
Sure. Well, and things change. There's lose jobs. There are good, valid situations. When the buyer no longer qualifies.
But you as the agent prepare the paperwork.
You'll send it to the listing, but the buyer is the one who signs off on.
Yes.
Because in the track promulgated notice termination of contract by buyer, that's the second choice, the financing choice, and that's the one that only the buyer signs. So you fill it out, you check off the correct box and send it forward. And make sure you do check off the correct box.
But most all title companies will require the release.
Yeah, because they're constantly playing that CYA game. Over your assets. I want to touch just briefly on the 3 approvals. As you see there on page 3 and 4. It's important for you to know if there's financing, that there are 3 approvals in the transaction, where they are, what they are, the timing, how the lender impacts on that. We got the property approval, the buyer approval, and final loan approval coming out of underwriting. And it talks on this page, the next page, that the property approval, which we see there in paragraph 2B, only deals with the property, nothing to do with the buyer. Buyer approval only deals with the buyer. And you'll see on page 2 of the third-party financing exam, which you should have in your package. The top there talks about buyer's income, credit history. That's buyer approval. So people sometimes look at that data and say, Bob, we're coming up on the end of 21 days in buyer approval. We don't have the appraisal yet. You don't need the appraisal. The appraisal doesn't have anything to do with buyer approval. That's property approval. So make sure you make the distinction about which is important, which you need, which you have to do as you work through that. Now, final loan approval, not addressed anywhere in the contract. We know that clear to close coming out of underwriting has to happen, but it's nowhere in the contract. In my opinion, final loan approval is closing, digging in the check square. Still, we have final loan. Get all of that done. Till that happens, things happen, not just with buyers and sellers, things happen with lenders. FHA loan. We discovered the week before closing that the lender had been decertified by the government on FHA loan. They no longer could do an FHA loan. So it took some quick, fast tap dancing to get that shifted over to a lender who could actually do that as you work through that. So things happen. I mean, even though I kind of joke about it, I think that's really final loan approval. Closing, funding, and the check square. Sometimes we're talking recently. Left. Archer, you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Talking about the concept of FHA loans and appraisal waivers.
Uh-huh.
Because we know that we cannot use that addendum, the appraisal waiver addendum for FHA or VA.
Right.
So I just had a question earlier today from one of our really good agents. He said, I've got a buyer, FHA loan, and they're willing to pay $20,000 over if there's a gap. And we know we can't use the addendum, so what do we do?
Talk to an attorney.
Yeah, talk to an attorney. That's exactly right. You'd have to have attorney prepared language that goes in special provisions of the contract. And a good attorney will say to you, happy to do this, but if the buyer changes their mind, decides because it didn't appraise that they're going out of the deal, we don't know if the FHA rules will prevail over what's in the contract. We haven't had the test case in Texas that I'm aware of. I know we don't want to be the test case. But if our buyer says, yeah, I've got an attorney, you can put the language, you stick it in there, fine. You can do that. As you kind of, work through it. But you need to make that a little bit of a distinction as you kind of work through and deal with that.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah.
I've also seen on some third-party financing addendums where the buyer's agent will put a different number in paragraph 4 than what the sales price is as a way that they think they're getting around.
Yeah, we see in paragraph 4, which deals with FHA and VA, there's a blank in there. It should be the sales price. And we're seeing people, let's say you have a $400,000 sales price. And I said, well, I'll cover 10,000 of the gap. So they put in there 390,000. I don't think that fixes that problem.
Correct.
That's, I think you're right, Marcia. I think that's what they think they're doing. They work through that. Yes, sir.
Without legal counsel, would that be a track violation?
So the question that James has, without doing that with legal counsel, is that a track violation? You might be committing unauthorized practical law. You might be. I'm not concerned with that because nobody in this room or on the Zoom would do that. Right, Marcia?
Yes, you are absolutely right. Nobody. Especially not my people.
Not your people. So the lender in this whole program, let's talk about the lender for a second. In the class I do on multiple offers, you haven't done recently, but I think we'll do another at some point. I've got the 9 criteria that I use, that I teach in multiple offers. And so there are 9 criteria. The 9th one is the most important, and it's the certainty of close. Doesn't matter what anything else is in the offer. If it's not going to close, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if you're offering $2 million above sales price, above list value. Doesn't matter if it's not going to close. But one of the criteria is the lender. So I was at an open house recently with one of our good folks. And I just happened to get there and there were a lot of good attendance here and one of the prospect, in fact, they're actually have written an offer, even though it was recently listed and they came out in the open house, they've written an offer. And they had a pre-qual letter from one of the big lenders. You know, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, you know, one of the big lenders. And our agent who was holding the open house had obviously already had a little bit of a conversation with the buyer about one of the big lenders. And so it was upstairs, she said, so Bob, what's your thought about? She named the company. I said, well, here's our challenge with big lenders. You don't always find yourself dealing with the same person all the time. Our general experience with big lenders is they don't perform. Don't close as they've agreed to. In fact, one of our experiences has been that many buyers who work for one of those lenders won't use it for their loan because they know what they do. So I say, as a general rule, I think that a buyer who's in a multiple offer situation, being off situation, who the lender is really important. We don't get to control who the lender is. The seller can decide this particular lender over this lender, that's a higher certainty of close. Good local lender who is a person that I can call and talk to, or if I need to go knock on the door and walk in and talk to them, that's valuable. And that's really helpful. And we've had situations, we had one fairly recently. We had a lender challenge. It was a good local lender. And we weren't getting things the way we should have. And so the agent went to their place and parked herself in the lobby and said, I'm not leaving until I get an answer. And she was able to, you know, they said, okay, fine. You had one of the big lenders at 800 and I was like, yeah, you can't do that. Don't get that. So doesn't mean that they don't close deals because they do a ton of business. I mean, that's why they're a big company. One of my insurance in USAA, great insurance company, terrible lender. I wouldn't use them for mortgage if I was going to do one. But those big lenders, you have to be careful with them. So who the lender is important. One of the other things that's important, that shouldn't be, is who the agent is.
Is what?
Who the agent is. Who the agent is on the multiple offer shouldn't be important. Well, it can be important if your seller really likes that offer because it's a really good agent. And you, the listener, said, you know, I've had great experience with this agent. And Marcia certainly knows her husband, Larry, is very good at that. I mean, he's really good at establishing those relationships. That's why he's able to get so many of his buyers into contracts. It's because he established a relationship with a listing agent. They feel good about his offer.
Yeah.
You notice I didn't say that while he was here.
I know. Thank you for that.
But it is. I mean, that agent is really important. If you had a really bad experience with that agent every time, without being critical, which is Article 15 violation, without being critical of that fellow realtor, your seller has a right to benefit from your experiences because if that agent's not going to perform and help us get this thing to closing, your seller shouldn't enter into contract with that buyer.
It makes a difference. I just executed a contract last week and was able to talk to the other agent and because we have a buyer. And because we developed such a good relationship, they had another offer come in and we played hot and cold and I was able to offer less than listing and they went with our offer. So it makes a huge difference how you talk to and how respectful you are of people on the other side. It's a different company than us. And we literally got the deal because of the fact that he had enjoyed conversing with me and professionalism and responsiveness and everything else. And we got it 45,000 less than list.
Yeah, I tell you what, the agent part is so important. Plus, good relationship with an agent like that, it's a great recruiting opportunity.
We're getting there. We're not close. We're not closing until the 23rd. It was quick close.
Okay.
But we're going, we'll go there. Don't worry.
Now, let's talk about something that's really a best practice situation. And we're struggling right now. We're working through some good answers on this. And one of the things you've got there is page 2 of the contract, paragraph 5. And we've got a situation that's popped up that we've had to work our way through. I've talked to a number of good title company attorneys. I've talked to Jerry Prager, who is the attorney of record for Netris and Prometric. Jerry and I served at the same time on the Broker Lawyer Committee. I have great respect for him. Very knowledgeable. And he and I discussed this, and partly because we know how this language happened. Not with our Broker Lawyer Committee, just happened way past when we were on. There's some ambiguous language in this, and we've had some situations happen because we have a situation where the buyer is the earnest money and the option fee to the title company. It's not a change for the earnest money, but it's a change for the option fee. And when this goes to the title company, and in many cases, maybe most cases, it's wired, depending on the amount of money it is. And most of the time, it's one amount. And so when the title company gets it, the title company will receive that information, will receive, the option fee and the earnest money, receive it. And generally, they'll notify the listing agent, we've received it, we have the money. We had a situation recently where we had the seller and the buyer got the earnest money and option fee to the title company on the 4th day. Well, that's late. And the title company sitting there with the money. And these aren't the exact numbers, but let's just use the numbers that the earnest money was 5,000, the option fee was 1,000. And one of the things that's caused this to be an issue now is the option fees have gone up dramatically. We're talking thousands of dollars in option fees. So in this case, 5,000, 1,000. So 6,000 comes too late on the 4th day. So when the title company gets the money, they deposit it. If it gets wired, it goes into their account. They get checked, they deposit it. So they've got the money and it's on the 4th day. Now, paragraph 5. 5D. Failure to timely deliver option fee. If no dollar amount is stated as the option fee, or if buyer fails to deliver the option fee within the time required, buyer shall not have the unrestricted right to terminate this contract under this paragraph 5. When the buyer's option fee on that earnest money didn't get to the title company till the 4th day, technically, your 5D, I didn't have an option. Now, title company notifies the seller. So it says, yeah, we're okay with it. That's okay. Things happen. Still like the contract, we want to move forward. We'll accept the money. We're good with that. What the seller has just done is ratify the buyer's option period. One of the clear rules that all the attorneys agree with me on. If you take the buyer's money for an option, they have to have an option. You can't say, well, take 1,000, thank you very much, but by the way, it's late, so you don't get an option. No. If you take the money, they have an option in the conversation. So when the seller receives that information from the title company, we've received it, but it's late. The seller then has to make a decision, and the sense is it needs to be fairly prompt. Next couple of days. If we wait till 20 days later, they may have lost their right to take it away. And it's no way the option period is going to be that long anyway, much shorter. So the seller, if the seller says, you know what, it's late. A flaky buyer, I knew this was a flaky buyer from day one. So I'm not going to accept that money. Well, that money is going to go back to the buyer. The earnest money and the option fee back to the buyer. And the buyer doesn't have an option. And effectively, what the buyer is also saying is we're past the 3 days and we're terminating the contract. Because the seller has a right to terminate the contract if they don't receive the earnest money in those 3 days. I think this answers my question. Okay. So our challenge is best practices. First best practice, if you got the buyer, get the money there in time. Don't let it happen. And we understand things happen, but don't let it happen. Second, if you've got the seller, educate the seller. If that money comes in late, here are your choices. Here's what you get to do. What do you want to do? The best seller has been a little antsy from day one with these buyers. They're kind of flaky buyers. And we're happy to get rid of them. And they get to make that decision because they have a right to do it. They have a right to accept that money late and still give the buyer the option or not accept. But we have to be prepared to deal with it whichever direction they want to go. So this is the best practices. Different title companies have different positions on that. Dr. Charles Kramer, the reason I mentioned Charles Kramer is he was the chair of the Broker Lawyer Committee when they created this paragraph 5. They created this new language and these new provisions. So he was in the room when they did this, so he knew what they were thinking. He said, Bob, I have to admit to you that they weren't clearly thinking all of this. They weren't. In fact, I talked to Jerry Prager about this. He said, yeah, it's very ambiguous. And he said 2 things. One, he says, I think Texas Rollers need to write an article, Texas Roller Magazine, talking about this. He says, plus we need to send something to the Broker Lawyer Committee to clarify some of their language. Make it a little clearer about what the rights of the parties are. So this is one of those cases where we really need to step into best practices and educate our buyers moving forward. Because what you cannot do is rely on the fact that, well, we understand the title company, all they're doing is receiving the option and they're not ratifying the option period. When they receive, 4 days into, the title company doesn't look to see how many days it was. They don't say, okay, it's late, it's not late. That's not their job. They took the money, they receipted it, they notify the seller listing agent, we received the earnest money and the option fee. And then the seller needs to make some decisions there. So because the title company is not going to do anything, best practice is we've got to be prepared. If we get that late, have our seller be educated, make a decision. I mean, we really got to work harder to get our buyer to put that money up. Because one of the reasons we went from giving this money to a seller or give it to the title company is we were having trouble getting it to the seller. Can you find the listing? Where are they? What's going on? So theoretically, by doing this way, we always can take it to the title companies, know where they are. Well, go ahead and do it. Don't fiddle around. In fact, one of the little recommendations that actually is made in one of the GR contract classes is that when you've got the buyer, go ahead and have the buyer, if you're going to pay by check, make out that check to the title company even before you're going to do an offer. Because that way you don't have to worry about getting them later when they get their offer accepted in its contract and you need to get that money to them, going out and finding them. Okay, oh, didn't we tell you we were in Utah for a couple of weeks now? Yes, Tommy?
A lot of title companies now are allowing you to use like Zocam,
Yeah,
a lot of electronics.
absolutely. You've got other ways of getting that money to them. I don't want to wire it. You're right. But you always need to check with the title company to see what they accept. I think that'll increase even more as technology is better. Okay?
So just for clarity, if the buyer delivers the earnest money to the title company on the 4th day, as soon as that money is delivered to the title company, do they lose their option of terminating the contract?
So what have they delivered?
Earnest.
You can't deliver just earnings. You've got.
Sorry, all of it, all of it, all of it.
So they get it on 4th day.
4th day.
So if all the title company's done is receipted it and given that notice to the seller. It's now the seller's decision to decide where the buyer has an option period or not.
So if the seller did want to terminate that, they've been feeling like this.
The seller has no termination rights.
Well, but if the earnest money is delivered within a certain period of time, they do. Right?
That could give.
If the earnest money is not delivered in the 3 days, you have 3 full days, then the seller can terminate the contract or fail to deliver earnest money as long as they do it before the buyer finally deposits the earnest. So here we are on the 5th day. The seller said, yeah, thanks, Adam, I'm okay, then the seller said, yeah, I think it's a flaky buyer, we're going to terminate. And the buyer wakes up all of a sudden and says, oh, man, we got to get that earnest money over there. If the buyer gets that earnest money to the title company before the seller's in termination, the seller doesn't have that termination anymore. They have to do it before that earnest money is deposited with the title company.
So they have to terminate 3 days.
No, whatever the time frame is, it's before. So
Right.
they have to wait full 3 days, 11:59 p.m. the 3rd day. You've got to give that amount of time to the buyer. If the buyer hasn't done it by the end of that 3rd day,
Then what does the seller do?
then the seller can decide the next day, I'm going to terminate. and there's a seller's termination contract, and it's the only pre-printed text. The seller is terminating as a result of failure to deliver the earnest money. But if before the seller gets that termination to the title company, the buyer shows up with the earnest money, termination doesn't apply. James?
I'm sorry, I had a question, but I'm taking it back.
Okay.
I think that I got a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So it's the fourth day. They get the money there, the option in the earnest, that takes away the seller's termination rights.
Correct.
Gotcha. All right.
If he accepts the money.
What they,
Based on the delivery of earnest money, correct. Now, remember, there is no automatic happening on the fourth day. 11:59 PM on the third day, we're now at midnight on the fourth day. There's no automatic termination. Seller doesn't have to do it, they just have a right. Holly?
I think you maybe need to make clear, because a lot of people are not.
She thinks I can make anything clear. I love her
You're very
optimism.
good at that. But right now, in this crazy market, there have been instances where the buyer never paid the option fee and they terminated during auction. Or they terminated and they say they're using the HOA out as opposed to delivering option and saying they're terminating the option fee. So
Okay, so let's talk
so
about
understand where
this
you're
right of
saying
termination.
earnest money
Yeah.
specifically, not option fee.
First of all, if one thing you need to recognize, any money that goes to the title company, if there's something in paragraph 5 that addresses there is an option and an option period, option fee, then the title company will take any money and apply it first to the option, and whatever's left over to the earnest money. So that's going to happen. And she's right. There are buyers who say, you know, now that I think about it, I really don't want to do that $1,000 option because I don't think we want to buy this. We don't get self-disclosure notice. We got other rights of termination. If when they complete the direct promulgated notice of termination contract by buyer form, they better check off the right box. If they check off the very first box, which deals with the option period, they have to pay the option fee. You don't get to terminate on the option provision without paying the fee.
so what other box is there beside that?
Self-disclosure, actually 8 boxes.
Okay.
Self-disclosure, I would encourage you.
Okay.
Self-disclosure, you got the HOA, you got third-party financing, you got condominium. All those rights termination, you make sure you check off the right box. And HOA is one that the option will do. And so if they do under the HOA, you need to make sure we follow what we just talked about a little bit earlier. If they do it, but what they've got to do is if they have option in paragraph 5, they've got a dollar amount in there. Say, well, I'm just going to pay the earnest money. Don't get just pay the earnest money. Any money that goes to the title company be applied to the option and then to the earnest money, which by the way, creates a problem. Because there won't be enough left over for the full earnest money, which gives a seller termination right. Question.
If the buyer still want to do inspection without.
Okay, so the question is a buyer allowed to do inspections and they haven't paid the option? And it's correct, they can. Once we have a contract, paragraph 7A applies. And paragraph 7A is what gives the buyer rights to access the property, rights for inspection, has nothing to do with the option. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have listing agents say, whoa, I don't think so. You know, we just got a contract yesterday and you're already doing inspection today and we haven't seen any money yet. What's going on here? Well, read the contract. They have the right, buyer has a right. Because buyer said, well, you know what? The reason you took my offer, pay a big option fee, and we got a 3-day option period. We got a weekend coming up. I got to do an inspection right now. And I don't have to pay the option for 3 days, so work with me here. But yeah, it'd be a little bit of a challenge. James?
I have seen wording where the seller has indicated no inspections, special provisions until the option fee has been
They
paid.
can't supersede the contract.
No. Okay. If the seller. So what James is saying, he's seen situations because he runs around with a wild crowd. He's seen situations where seller puts something in paragraph 11 special provisions where the buyer is not allowed to do inspections until they pay the option fee. Now, here's the rule of things that are inserted into a contract. First of all, there has to be attorney prepared language that affects the rights of the parties, not just a business detail. If something is inserted in a contract that contradicts with pre-printed text, what was inserted prevails. prevails over the pre-printed text. Because the reason is you put something in here to change what was agreed to in the pre-printed text. It's like you can say, you know, buyer says, I want the seller to pay for the appraisal. Well, in paragraph 12 would be that it's a buyer. First thing you buyer is appraisal. So they can make those kinds of changes. If they make a change like that, better be attorney prepared. That'll supersede what's in the pre-printed text. So they get to do that.
But it has to be in legal, I mean, lawyer language, right?
It should be lawyer language. Our constant challenge on the buyer side is when the listing agent says, yeah, we've had our attorney draw this up. The buyer has to decide, no. Buyer decide if they want to accept that or not. And buyer says, okay, I understand, and we're going to trust that it was an attorney. Right now, we don't have that attorney's name, we want his credentials, what's his license number, Does he know anything? No. I mean, it looks like you had a question.
That's just the way.
Zoom question, Bob.
So did I understand that there's no attorney when buyers came over, right, I don't know, we didn't, it was actually three lawyers title. Would that be who we would go here?
Okay, so her question is, she came from another community where they had an attorney, the head was an attorney that they accessed a lot.
Exactly.
He wasn't on staff.
Right.
Every once in a while, you'll find a broker that said, every once in a while, I'll come across a broker who actually retains an attorney. I and John have talked about that from time to time. But if we retain an attorney, it would be to advise our office, not our clients. Because one of the TREC rules, we cannot pay directly or indirectly the fees of a client. And I think having an attorney that's going to provide them with legal advice is doing that, at least indirectly. So we make use of Brandon Large Title, Charles Kramer, Jeff Milligan, or more, a number of other attorneys. Yeah, sure. And especially the title company attorneys are generally really good about each language on something, working it out. However, frustration is always, when you have an attorney drawing up that language that you in 2 sentences could have done, it's a half a paragraph, because they have to roll that attorney to legalese. Yes, sir.
You can start the paragraph off saying whereas.
Whereas, good legal everybody. Whereas we're in and what we're in. And have them explain to you the difference between making a decision with prejudice or without prejudice.
Prejudice.
We're talking about discrimination here. We're just trying to get legal stuff. Oh, yeah, right. First time you've ever been in a lawsuit situation that was resolved and it was resolved with prejudice, you go, what does that mean? Oh, that means they can't file it again. Oh, you know that. So paragraph 5 is your work in progress, and best practices is what we just talked about, that you really got to work hard on that, because we don't know what the title company is going to do. They don't even know.
Bob, Zoom question.
Yes.
Hey, for new agent application here. So the execution date of the contract is considered day 0, correct? And then we start counting from there.
Yes.
So we have 3 full days under.
Yeah, because you see the language that says after.
Right.
So the after means you're right. Day of the contract is 0. Day 1 is after the effective date of the contract.
Okay, just
So the
clarifying.
option
Thank you.
period, for example, which is a defined term, the option period itself, first day of the option period is the day after the effective date of the contract.
Hey, Bob,
Thank you,
I have.
But do you have a follow-up to that, sir?
Annabelle's trying to ask a question.
Okay, but yeah, I'm not sure he was finished.
No, I'm good. I just wanted to
Okay, so
clarify.
Annabelle, what you got?
Yes, we just received an offer where the option period, it says 9 business days.
Where does it say 9 business days? Did they insert that in paragraph 11?
Yes, they inserted in there oh
So
my
who did
gosh,
it,
I
the
don't,
buyer or the seller?
the buyer.
Okay. Did you represent the buyer?
No, I have the listing.
You're the listing agent?
Yes, I'm the listing agent.
Okay, so you need to advise your seller to seek legal advice on the impact of business days in the contract and the addendums to the contract. it does things. Beyond, it's not just that specific paragraph. If they put business days, it may be applied to all performances in the contract. We don't know. And if it does, if you've got closing and you've got a closing and business day applies, I mean, it can do all kinds of different things. So you need to tell your clients seek legal advice before they accept it. And a number of particularly institutional sellers and buyers will try to use business days instead of calendar days. Some states, their contract, California, for example, their contracts are business days. So it's very, but it has an impact. It can have an impact on the contract beyond what they expect it to do. So you want to be careful with that.
Yeah, so the whole contract, it says business days. Everywhere they just insert for
Okay, so are you
for
saying that they
every
put the
everything.
business days in paragraph 11, that all days in the contract are business days instead of calendar days?
Yes,
Or did they
that's
do
correct.
that in each paragraph where they wrote in somewhere on the side there, business days?
They wrote it on the side, like they
Okay,
they
that's
just
sloppy.
inserted.
That's terrible. Your seller needs to really look hard at accepting that buyer's offer. If there are any
Okay.
other offers that are as good or whatever, or our seller needs to clean it up and change it. Because now the buyers, your seller's gonna have to initial all those places. And he's gonna have to have legal advice on what it does to him under certain performances to change that from calendar days to business days. Which is gonna impact on performances. But he needs to have legal advice where he does that. You
Okay,
good?
thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I do want to go to, I think you've got one you should have in your packet, from Texas Realtors. It talks about PIDs, public improvement districts. And it's a really good reference. It's got a lot of answers in there. And it answers a lot of things about PIDs and preaching and all that.
What did they change? That? Is that last? Is it September?
21, well, September, in effect, September 1st of 2021. Yeah. That's when they had that addendum was created and worked through all that, and you've got a copy of the addendum for improvement districts. Plano only has 2 improvement districts. They've got the downtown one, you've got the one for Collin Creek Mall, the new development for Collin Creek. I don't know of any others unless somebody else knows of some, Plano.
I just think we need to offer another class on it since it's been over 6
Yeah, and I think what we're gonna do at the end of this month is we're gonna have another title company person come in and talk to us about PIDs and MUDs and SUDs and RUDs and DUDs and all those other kinds of things. Work through that. Because the form itself, which looks a little, what I feel like is incredibly simple. It really is. You're dealing with the name of the PID. It's not a hard form to complete fill out. Your challenge is for the seller to determine, in fact, if they're in a PID. And, sometimes how can we help you with that? If it's a new home subdivision, it's probably a PID because the developers are using PIDs to pay for the infrastructure. Work through all that. But when you look at the form itself, for example, if you have someone up in Salina, the first thing you're going to do where it talks about city or the county is whoever approved it. Like Salina's got a ton of PIDs. 30 something. Every one of them has a name and they all fall under the city. I think there may be 1 or 2 that are in the extraterritorial jurisdiction that are in the county. But even those may have been approved by the city council. So that's what you're going to address up here when it says, insert name of municipality or county levy assessment, whatever that is. Whether or not it's city of Salina, county, whatever happens to be that does it. And then you put the street address and the name of it. All these other blanks in here, again, you repeat again, naming of municipality and so forth. In that first paragraph, where it talks about subchapter A, chapter 372 local, that in fact is what, except for 2 counties down around San Antonio, all the counties in Texas, all the bids in Texas are under chapter 372. So you'll always have that. And then again, you have more names of specialty court, so forth. And then the assessments. And your seller should get that assessment. For example, when you pull up one in Salina and UNA, it'll actually tell you, here's what the total is, like 7,959,000. That's the total amount, and they do a budget each year in their plan to determine the prorated cost for each of the property owners in that. Have your seller may have had that and made part of his escrow and his taxes and insurance as part of the escrow. It's always surprising how many sellers don't know if they're in a pit or not. Sometimes it was a fairly recently creative pit, and he said, well, I don't see anything in my assessments or whatever, and they may not even assess you, may not even charge you anything. Our challenge is, our best practices situation is, if you've got a seller, you need to find out. And in the Q&A, one of the things that you'll discover, and this reverend handout out here that you have here, I would really encourage you to read through and look at it, is the penalties to the seller for not providing the addendum or the notice from the pit on or before when the buyer enters into a contract, or certainly before closing. Buyer's termination rights. Now, that's really still happening. I talked to the title company, said, you know what, really not seeing anything done until closing. And except for one of which I'll talk about in a second. So it's part of the paperwork at closing. It's provided to the buyer at closing, and the buyer signs off on the closing. If they decide they didn't want to close and they didn't receive it on or before the effective date of the contract, you terminate. If the buyer signs off on that notice of closing, then they've lost all rights to damages or suit or whatever. But if the buyer somehow ends up going through a closing without the notice for this addendum being used, the buyer can require rescission of the contract, require the seller to take back the property.
What you said?
What?
After closing?
After closing. If they never were presented, they never signed off on the notice or the addendum, after the fact, they can sue damages and they can make the seller take the property back. Huge hit.
I've heard this.
Yeah. So, and the title companies I've talked to, only one of them had a buyer terminate prior to closing. Based on this, based on they hadn't received it yet. So for the most part, everybody just does it at closing. This is the way that is. Yes, sir.
So how long after closing can a buyer ask for that receipt?
Okay, so the question that James asked is how much longer after closing? We don't know. That's a legal issue. I don't know how much, I don't know whether the statute of limitations come into play. You could have to make a case for, here's what happened, here's why we didn't know it. I'm sure there's some statute of limitation timeline.
It seems like there was I've heard something in my office where several properties were closed without proper notice.
Yeah.
So it's starting to become an issue as the seller's getting ready to sell. They may have some issues and it's getting real complicated.
So the buyer later is getting ready to sell and receive it. We still have a right to.
So the contemplating, do they have that right?
That's a good question. You're gonna get the answer and you'll be back with them.
My office line, and I will be glad to be the conveyor, but
Conveyor of.
personally take on that.
Now, remember, when you take on the responsibility to be a conveyor, you're now responsible for that information.
I need to get.
As opposed to, Bob, here's the attorney, or here's the big guy that I talked to, and here's what he says, and here's his number. So Bob, you want to follow up and call and talk to him and make sure it's solved.
I will see what I can obtain, and I will update you, Mr. Baker.
I appreciate that greatly. Any more questions on this before I go to another little interesting topic? Agreement between brokers. The two of them. One deals just with leases. The other deals with sales and leases. 2402 deals with sales and leases. 2002 deals with leases. There's some choices in 2002, the agreement between brokers for leases. But you want to be careful with the language. There's places where you insert things, and when you look at, you've got a lease situation between leases. And maybe you want to address if the landlord sells the property to the tenant. Or renewal of a lease. And you put in there that you want to be paid on renewal of a lease. There's language in there that the listing agent is only required to pay you once he receives that money from the landlord. If he doesn't receive the money from the landlord, he's not obligated to pay you. Same thing in the 2402 agreement between brokers, in that section in there where it deals with leases, deals with sales. It has some of that same language that they're only obligated to pay us if they receive the land, if they pay us out of the money they receive from the landlord. So if you use an agreement between brokers 2402 and let that language lie in there, and you're doing the lease situation. And we just went through this on one of our transactions. We still, I've just talked to you, we still haven't been paid. And the other company said, well, we just last week finally received money from the landlord. The language that they've got in the agreement between brokers, they have to pay us until they receive their money. So you want to at least be aware of that. They can kind of get in the way of what you got coming. Because our basic thought is whatever they put in MLS, they owe us whether they get paid or not. But if you have language in one of those agreements between lease between brokers, then that may not. You work through that. Makes so much sense. What other big issues are you guys jumping all over and say, wow, man, how come we haven't talked about this? Kansu, you have something?
I have a quick question about the paragraph 20 about the
About FERPTA?
foreigner.
Paragraph 20 of the contract, which deals with FERPTA, foreign investors. Yeah.
Yeah. The paragraph 20.
What's your question about foreign investors, buyers or sellers?
Yes, I'm a
And it only addresses sellers.
I'm a buyer's agent. The seller is a foreigner and it's a
How do you know that?
title company. They notice me and my buyer.
Okay, that's the point. Okay, has he resolved his tax issues?
Yeah. So I don't know if this one could hurt my buyer or we don't have any contingency. We should terminate this contract. So I don't know if under the closing day, is this tax should pay for my buyer should pay or my seller.
Okay, remember,
So.
the concept of FERPTA, this may be another thing we need to clear in class, which deals with foreign sellers. It's incredibly important to know the policy of the title company, how much of that they'll handle. Some title companies jump all over. Republic does. I'm sure Chicago does. They're really helping out with it and make sure it gets taken care of. Some title company says, God, this is kind of your problem. It's buyer and seller issue. We're not involved on any level at all. What can happen, unless the buyer has an attorney prepare some language to give him some protection, what can happen at closing is if the seller has not taken care of it, is there some tax liability, then the buyer out of the sales proceed, not the buyer otherwise. The buyer is not paying this. Money that's being sent to the IRS for the seller's tax issues is out of the sales proceeds that we go to the seller. So it's the buyer who's having to send it to the IRS because that's the IRS requirement. And a good title company like Republic, Chicago, will actually help them fill out the form and send the money to the IRS. So you need your best practices, talk to the title company and find out from them, what's your policy? How much of this are you going to help us with as we kind of work through it? Because our challenge is, in your case, your lease are ahead of the game because the title company said it's a foreign person. And did they say, he says his tax has been taken care of? So we move forward relying on that. What you're going to do is relay to your buyer, here's what the title company said. I hope that ends up being true closing. Because if it's been resolved and there's an action in IRS form, it still has it, deals with that, then nothing happens at closing related to that. Only happens at closing that the seller refuses to sign that notarized statement. Says that they're not a foreign person. If they refuse to sign that, or we have some indication that they haven't satisfied it, that they miss the I am a foreign person. I haven't paid my taxes in years. What do I care? Going back to Aruba and they can't extract. So we have situations like that and deal with it, then the title company, even though it's the buyer's responsibility, the IRS is tend to press title companies, say, you know what, at closing, you better not close this transaction and give the seller all their money. Give it back, he owes us money. It's kind of your job, even though it's the buyer's responsibility to pay it, but the buyer's not paying it out of their pocket. They're paying it out of the sales proceeds of the transaction. So the buyer needs to understand, this is not my money. This is not my money. This is the seller's money.
Title company. Take it out for you.
Well, and it's got to be sent in.
Yes.
There's a time frame. It's got to go to the IRS. I want to say it's 30 minutes or an hour and a half. or-
Your title company, you have to let the title company know. The title company will take it and take care of it for you. But if you
Depending on the
don't,
title company.
well, depending on the title company. That's why your title company is important. But it's up to you to take action. It doesn't
As the
magically
seller.
happen. Well, no, as
As the
the
seller.
buyer. And to advise,
The buyer.
to help your buyer, well, not, because technically your buyer's the one doing it, you're not a part of the contract, but this is why you need to know this stuff to be able to advise your buyer about it.
That's why it's so important to be talking to the title company. Yes, ma'am.
Mine is a seller. The seller, their husband and wife. The husband is the wife is an American citizen, but the husband he is a green card holder. So that's one of her questions. Like, if they sell the house, the one that I'm gonna be listing, she's asking about taxes.
Send them to the title company, let them get a good information. That's your job.
Okay.
You don't get to interpret that. You don't get to say you're a citizen, you're not a citizen. You're clearly a foreign person. I can just tell by your accent. You're a foreign person.
What about for closing? Because there's a likely chance she would close without the husband. Do we need a power of authority?
Well,
Do we do Zoom? Like, how is that?
again, you gotta talk to the title company, how they want to work through that. That's why who the title company is how I point out, is really important because there's so many things that they help us with. And one of the little challenges with title companies, by the way, is the really good title companies provide so many services for us. At some point in time, kind of default to them. We think it's their job. It's not. They're just providing good customer service. If it's not their job, for example, order up the HOA information, it's not their job to order up the survey. They're not a party to the contract. They do that as good customer service, to the agency.
And they could be a foreigner, but not tax wise.
Correct, that's correct. They may not be subject to FERPA.
Yeah, they could be a foreigner, but they could be paying their
Yeah.
taxes.
It could be from Oklahoma, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Well, that is a foreigner.
It's a foreigner.
Your nationality, and then there's for taxes, if you're paying,
Yeah.
for tax versus if you're.
She's exactly right. That's why a good conversation with the title company, say, hey, what,
Yeah.
our good title company attorneys, hey, how that works.
Like governments allowed them to work here, so giving them like a.
Yeah.
green card, but it's called.
Something else.
look it up. Don't look it up because I have this in my, and they're paying their taxes, so they're paying their.
So they're good.
Yes, so they're good. So they're
Yeah.
not, they could have been born in a foreign country, but they're in the US working and they've been allowed, it's kind of like a social security, kind of like a 10/ or whatever it's called.
Yeah, and be careful, and this is right, but be careful as you go down the road
But let title decide.
and define, well, you got a green card, you don't have a green card, you have a student visa, you've got a working visa.
Yeah.
And I mean, one thing is, if you're dealing with people in areas like Oklahoma, everybody there is a foreign person.
Like technology, I had a tech, he's from India, but he's got the right to his company. So it's working with the US. So it's allowed to do that.
Guys, thank you very, very much for being here. I greatly appreciate it. You've done a great job. Thank you very much. For the rest of the day, questions?
So tomorrow's committee meeting, everybody, if you want to have influence on what classes we teach, like having a Mudslips and Pudge coming up or a FERPTA class, attend the development committee meeting, which is at 11 o'clock. 12 o'clock is growth, 1 o'clock is the fun committee with Tommy and I, because he'll be giving legal advice evidently. And then also something important to put on your calendar is June 22nd from 1 to 3, we have a realtor safety class with June 22nd with Officer Vianis from Plano PD.
He's a funny guy.
He's a funny guy. So June 22nd, safety, tomorrow committee meetings. And what time was it? What time was the committee meeting? Committee meetings start at 11 is development, 12 is growth, and then 1 o'clock is culture.
Come on, for the 22nd.
The 22nd, 1 to 3, 2-hour class. So thank you.
Yes.
All right.
Can you repeat that? Because as I hear we're talking.
Yeah, okay, committees are safety. So committee meetings are tomorrow. They're 11:00. It's developments. 12:00
Good idea.
road, 1:00 is culture. Everybody's invited to all the committees. Just to come and see. And then June 22nd
Now you got your-
is realtor
Even under
safety,
duress.
and also some home safety, and that's from 1 to 3 on June 22nd.
Sign up for that or we're good.
Realtor safety is from 1 to 3.
And it's here.
And it will be here in this class. Yes.
I thought these calendars to you guys.
Yeah, it's on the calendar. But sometimes people don't read calendars, and sometimes they don't read the text, sometimes they don't read your email, sometimes they don't look at Facebook. So that's why I tried verbally announce it to you.
Is.
Yeah.
Is.
Because he's.
James E.
Hey, I think you're covering it all. You can ball.
Yes, sir. Okay, let me turn this off.
So teachers are. Republic